friends. I'm Han Koehle, and I use they and it pronouns. I am a non-binary disabled scholar, and I usually am talking about gender specifically, and I'm talking about fat today. I'm a fat scholar, and it shapes my experience of academia. And I'm really, really excited to be here. This is my first visit to UCLA. Hopefully my next one will be in person in a very safe way, but I'm very excited to be here virtually today. And I'm really interested in understanding how health equity happens and how health inequity happens, which are different questions. But I love that Caitlin said both, because I am interested in both. And so increasingly for me, my work looks at how major social institutions like education, healthcare, and policing are co-constitutive. And my home discipline is sociology, but my work draws from history, philosophy, folklore studies, cultural studies, social work. And I have had the really cool experience of developing the Health Equity Initiative at UCSB, which seeks to eliminate stigma-related health disparities for UCSB students. And often at UCSB, our meetings and workshops begin with a land acknowledgement, which I know can land different ways for different folks. And a big criticism that I'm aware of is that simply naming the traditional stewards of the land doesn't actually address or challenge the ongoing process of colonization that universities materially participate in and co-construct. So before we get into gender and fatness, we're gonna have a quick moment of settler colonialism discussion. So in preparing for this, I learned a little bit more about the history of UCLA and the history of UCSB, which is my home campus, in terms of settler colonialism, including learning that the area stretching from Santa Maria to Long Beach was seized via an unratified treaty on June 10th, 1851. And the University of California was really established as an original plan as part of the California Genocide, which was a war of extermination against indigenous people that killed, in which settlers from the United States killed more than 100,000 people and enslaved about 25,000 more, including thousands of children. The university received 148,000 acres of expropriated indigenous land as part of that war of extermination. So when we talk about our role in building justice, we have to really start by looking at our role in injustice. And the University of California scholars have played important roles in developing the policy and theory of US domination in the generations since that expropriation, including the development of the eugenics movement and the forced sterilization of tens of thousands in California between 1909 and 2008. My home campus, UCSB, is located on Chumash land, and this workshop is virtually located on Tongva land, both of which are in an ongoing process of colonization via overt force and systematized exposure to extralegal violence and illness and disparate medical access and treatment, all of which culminates in disproportionate COVID-19 impacts. Often Native health is really left out of discussions of concern about structural community disparities, and even discussions specifically about race disparities in medicine often exclude Indigenous people, which leads people to the mistaken belief that those disparities don't exist, which is also something that happens to trans people and fat people. And that's not coincidental, because the structural causes of those are really bound up in settler colonialism and white supremacy in all cases. So for me, I've chosen to honor Indigenous land relations today by donating 100% of my speaking fee to SALO, an Indigenous women-led nonprofit that has provided emergency food aid to Indigenous families in Los Angeles during the pandemic. And I also wanted to use a little bit of my time here to draw attention to the LA County Department of Public Health publication, which I did a little tiny URL here, and I can also put that in the chat later to make that super easy. The end of this document includes letters from the Native American Indian Commission, the Black Equity Initiative, and the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Health Initiative about their priorities for addressing COVID-19. And as somebody who does equity work during COVID-19, I can tell you that a lot of people who are making health policy decisions in Los Angeles have never heard of these letters. So an opportunity for action today is read these letters and share them with people that you know in healthcare. So the main topic that I was really asked here to talk about is this is my main thesis for today, which is anti-fatness provides a mechanism of gender policing by which fatness constitutes gendered moral deviancy. So what I think is happening based on the research that I've done so far is whatever your gender is, if you're too fat, you're doing that gender wrong. And it's treated as a serious problem and specifically a moral violation against the community. This is not what my research was supposed to be about. As you might have expected, my research was about health inequity. And so my main research question was about how anti-fat bias impacts transition-related healthcare access. And this was my thesis research in 2016. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be drawing from are really around that time, which is right around the transgender tipping point, where trans people re-entered public discourse in a way that was unfamiliar within our generation. And things shifted on a legal level in the United States in a way that our generation was not familiar with. Part of why I'm so delighted to be here is this talk gives me an opportunity to really zoom in on one of those like delicious little surprises that came up in my research that wasn't actually part of my original research question and never got enough space in my thesis because of it. Because I was asking questions about healthcare access, I was really trying to answer that question. And it wasn't until this year that I got to say like, okay, that wasn't really what that data was. And as a thesis writer, I was really just trying to graduate. And so I've gotten to go back to that and say like, okay, well, what was actually happening here? And what was happening, if not the thing that I expected? And so part of this is one of the things that I kept coming back to was that fatness didn't act the way I expected it to, and it didn't act the way that some of the authors whose work I analyzed expected it to. So the quotes I'm going to pull from today are from narrative analyses of 13 public articles and posts written by trans people about navigating fatness and anti-fatness and gender transition around the time of the transgender tipping point. So I think that the earliest article was 2013 or 2014, and then they went through 2016. And there's one article that was originally part of my thesis research that has been since unpublished by the author. And because it contains some vulnerable public details that are published under the author's public name, I have not included this in subsequent analysis because according to the IRB, it's not human research, but I didn't feel like it was appropriate to continue digging into this person's really intimate personal narrative, even if it once had been public. So I've got 12 articles. They're massively different sizes. Some of them are, you know, a 1-paragraph prose poem that's like, hey, are you fat? I think you're cool. And your gender's super valid. And that's basically it. And some of them are thousands of words long and go very deep into these analytic and narrative depth that it's this beautiful range. And it was what I could find at the time. And it was so little, like 12 or 13 things at the time was everything I could find on the whole internet. And now it feels like there's so much more there. And there's certainly so much more that's published. And I think that the bibliographies between my original thesis and the chapter that comes out in Advances in Gender Research this November are just massively different. And most of the pieces that I cite in this year didn't exist when I did my original thesis research, because there just wasn't a lot of intersectional research on fatness and transness. And so it was like, well, there's one piece that's about law, but it does talk about fat people and trans people. So I'm going to look at that. And it's really beautiful to see the field of trans fat studies develop even over the last couple of years. And so some of this is really outdated because it's from 2016 and things have changed since then. But yeah, I'm really excited to get to zoom in and share this. So because a lot of the quotes that I pull from focus on experiences of external and internal gender evaluations, they don't necessarily reflect the author's considered commitments about gender. And so I'm going to be taking some stuff out of context, and I want to be really, really, really clear that I am taking these out of context. And often this is stuff that authors are saying to themselves when they are having a really rough time looking in the mirror, and not things that they would say as a tweet. You know, like, so I want to caution, I'm going to be talking about who said things in what context. And I don't want you to think that like these authors would say that to you, for instance. Also, a number of the authors have shifted pronouns and or names since the included pieces were published. And so wherever possible, I've updated how I refer to the authors, and that may look weird in context. So if it seems to conflict, be aware that like I'm working on 2021 information when I talk about the authors, but I'm still quoting from 2016 or before. So yeah, major themes. Gendered body norms are highly racialized. I know that you got a really fantastic talk about that earlier this month. Question mark? Yeah, so The Belly of the Beast is coming out soon. I have it pre-ordered. Everyone should pre-order it. I'm so bummed that I did not get to go to that talk, but yeah, so that came up in this work as well. Gendered body norms are highly, highly racialized. Also, just gender is not located in discrete body areas. It is pervasively embodied. This was one of the big surprises for me, and one of the things that I've come back to over and over again as a trans activist in the years since this research, that a lot of transphobic discourses are really about genitals and increasingly about chromosomes. But when trans people talk about what it's like to be in our bodies, and particularly what it's like to be in a fat trans body, those are not what we're talking about. The stakes of body legitimacy included emotional autonomy, moral status, and vulnerability to violence. So the stakes are extremely, extremely high and possibly life-threatening. And one of the things, going back to that original point, anti-fatness disrupts gender transition by disrupting gender legitimacy. And so the place that it disrupted, I was expecting to see narrative after narrative of clinicians saying you can't really be trans because you're fat. And I only found one example of that, which isn't to say that that doesn't happen, but the place that it came up most often was actually at the point where a person was saying, is it possible that I could be trans? And it was there that anti-fatness was saying, no, you absolutely cannot be because you're fat. And the anxieties and risks of body legitimacy were often managed through intentional weight change or semi-intentional weight change, which was sometimes, it sometimes seems like the intentionality was assigned post hoc, if that makes sense. So my original research question was largely motivated by my past experiences of fat phobia as a barrier to general healthcare, and my personal concerns as a person who was newly medically transitioning in 2016 in a context where medical transition access was extremely fraught. Ultimately, the data that I was able to find didn't have a lot to say about that provider-patient interaction. And as I discuss in this upcoming chapter, I didn't handle that super well as an emerging researcher. I sort of just tried to shoehorn back into the question that I had, and it ended up implying that anybody who could access gender transition through a medical framework would want to, which isn't something that I would have said at the time and is absolutely not true. Lots of people do not have any intention, any desire to transition medically. It's one framework that some people want and some people don't want. And so by translating all of these different narratives into a medicalized framework, I really replicated this idea that transness is a pathological problem and that it's corrected by changing the body. And that isn't something that has been borne out in the lives of the people whose work I was quoting in my thesis. In the years since, a lot of the folks have said, nope, I have no intention of ever transitioning medically. My body is not a problem. And so one of the things that was really wonderful for me in getting to go back to my thesis research was to say, like, this was a problem that I didn't navigate well because I was a new scholar and because I didn't know any other trans scholars at the time. I wasn't, or not in my discipline or anything close to my discipline. And so getting to see like what created the mistakes in my work and getting to go back and try to correct some of those mistakes in my work is part of what's been really exciting for me this year. So one of the exciting things that I love to get back to is locating gender in the body does not work the way it works in transphobic narratives and ciscentric narratives. I had 12 different authors, 10 of them located gender in fatness as a quality of the person. So this is absolutely not how we hear about gender most of the time, but it is really consistent with how, for instance, celebrities' bodies and genders are validated and invalidated. And this realness and validity was just as common as the concept of fatness as the location of gender. You can see genitals are way at the bottom. 2 people out of 12 talked about genitals when they were talking about gender legitimacy and locating gender in their embodiment. And I believe one of them was only talking about how other people reflected that her genitals were a problem. It wasn't an internal experience at all. And for most people, it was totally absent. Whereas you see belly is up at 5 and beauty's up at 7. And a lot of these aren't really body parts. But it was impossible for me to tease out and draw clear lines between, well, there's parts of the body, and then there's features of the body, and then there's features of the person, and then there's stuff that's clearly just not even tangible. Things like values, personality traits, where people said my gender was invalidated, but I had that trans boy bravery. And that bravery is where the masculinity is. It's fine that I'm fat because I've got a trans personality. And so these things aren't separated. We've got this sort of mind-body dualism assumption that a lot of us come in with, that, you know, some things are tangible and some things are intangible, some things are of the body and some things are of the mind or of society. And it really wasn't mediated in that way. It was much more entwined. And so rather than try to sort things out according to that, I want to say, like, it's actually experienced as enmeshed, that realness and validity is what gender is doing. And fatness is really, really in charge of that in a visible way, at least for people who are fat and trans. So you might be familiar with this one. The normative expectation for women was to be small, thin, pretty. And this is really well theorized, though a lot of transphobic narratives manage to assume that at the one hand, trans people are somehow exempt from this expectation while also applying it to trans people. So this definition wasn't only applied to trans women, and it wasn't only applied to people assigned female at birth. It was applied to basically everyone. And sometimes people experienced it in different moments, in different contexts, in different ways. But this was probably the most central narrative among all of the different genders and birth assignment experiences that people had. So this quote, "Who's ever heard of a 6'2", 320-pound woman," comes from Caitlin Burns' 2016 piece, "My Intersection with Being Fat and Transphobia." Burns is summarizing feelings that she had as she was confronting the possibility of being a trans woman, and how the social invisibility of fat women made it feel like it wasn't possible to be a fat woman, and that fat women literally cannot exist. For her, this social invisibility and this strong social norm for women to be small and thin created barriers that were just excruciating to seeing her own body, which was not small and not thin, as a woman's body. A woman can't be as big and fat as I am and still be desirable. This is from Mayrood's 2016 piece, "Fat, Trans, and Working on Being Fine with It." Like Burns, she summarizes this internal narrative that arose as she was grappling with her trans identity. And both pieces really beautifully demonstrate the author's confrontations with these social expectations about women's bodies as being small and thin and attractive, not just to be good women, but to be women at all. The definition of womanhood was echoed in the experiences of other authors who had been assigned female at birth. I wasn't feminine or girl enough to be seen as attractive, worthy of being treated like a human, or seen as innocent/controllable. This was Hunter Ashley Shackelford's 2016, "Why I'm Non-Binary, but I Don't Use They, Them." And this discussed their experiences as a child who was assigned a female gender role and simultaneously given feedback that a fat Black person cannot be a girl. So Shackelford's essay explores this way that being locked out of innocence meant being marked as sexually available and is incapable of victimhood. And that fatness and the way that that racialized and gendered fatness was placed on them was something that left them completely open to violence and deserving of violence, not in a way that Shackelford endorses, obviously, but in a way that was mirrored from others. Maybe you're just a fat lesbian. Victor Dynarski was the only person who actually did discuss a provider-patient interaction. And in this case, they presented at age 16 to a psychologist. And they said, "I wish I was a boy. I feel I am a boy. I want to do a sex change." And the clinician reflected that their discomfort with their body was rational because they're fat, and suggested that feelings of gendered discomfort must have this sexual explanation. And this conclusion was reached without inquiring about whether Dynarski was attracted to women. So lesbianism isn't about women being attracted to women, it's about women being not women, exactly. And so it was like, oh, you're an unattractive woman who's failing at your sex role. That's called a lesbian. And Victor was like, I don't think that that's what's going on, but didn't have another option and was 16. And this is why America has fallen into ruin. This one also comes from Mayrood and is a message about her being fat. She discusses that when she was in pre-transition childhood, her fatness was mocked as, unbefitting a young boy. It just took on all of this higher stake as an adult, where people marked her body not only as a problem for her, like she wasn't good enough, but it was suddenly harmful to others, that her fat Latina body is described as a threat to the state or society. So women are small and thin and heterosexual and attractive and innocent and controllable, and it is crucial for the state that that is true. And men are big, but not fat. So most of the narratives that I examined were really explicitly fat positive and often in a position of trying to learn to be fat positive. And this is an exception. This piece is from Jude Sampson from 2013. It's also either the earliest or one of the earliest pieces, and it's called Trans Fat, Obesity, and Trans Men. And it's explicitly written for those trans men who wish to achieve a higher level of appearance. He makes some gestures at validating that there are different possible desires about transition, but says that this framework really posits a hierarchy, that there's a better way to want to be and to achieve this higher level of appearance. And it provides some insight about the moral problem of fatness in men as being linked to masculine duties of discipline. So he says here, one solution, and solution is in quotes, to chest dysphoria is to allow the weight gain to take over so that the belly overcomes the chest, or so that people assume that the chest is just because you're overweight. So his article is really explicitly oriented towards encouraging weight loss in order to appear cis. But he has to acknowledge that some people can appear cis by gaining weight, and he has to grapple with that. And instead of saying like, yeah, you can lose weight to look cis or you can gain weight to look cis, he says, well, you can technically do either, but this is the correct way. So gaining weight is inappropriate. And he sort of makes some gestures that like, well, it's bad for you medically, or you might not be able to get top surgery if you gain weight because surgery, if you're trans, is only available to certain BMI categories. But the underlying framing hints at these moral implications that gaining weight in men is something that happens to men who are not disciplined about resisting the appetite stimulation of testosterone. And the language of weight gain that he uses is about allowing and overcoming. The fat happens to you. And if you are inappropriately passive, then you will be overcome by it and your body will be changed. And then maybe you'll look cisgender, but you're not really being manly because men are not receptive in this fashion. And he doesn't quite say it. He's struggling with it, and it almost seems like he's not sure why he has a problem with it. But all of the framing that he uses is using this passive language, this being overcome, allowing the weight gain to take over. And so it posits the weight gaining man as somebody who is too powerless to be a real man. And really points at, a man should be disciplined and in control and active. And these are familiar stereotypes. So I don't know if this is still Sampson's view about weight and gender. He's not remained as active online as some of the other authors, and I've been really curious about whether this has shifted for him, and I don't know. But another remarkable part of this piece particularly was that it posited a general trend among trans people about intentional weight change for gender affirmation. I think it was the only piece that I've seen that does that. And he says, trans women may develop bulimia or anorexia disorders in an attempt to shed weight and develop a smaller or more feminine appearance, while trans men may resort to overeating to bulk up. And so he shows this idea of like, yes, it can be disordered, it can be threatening to use body size changing to try to appear cis. What strikes me about this is that in the 12 articles that I looked at, the trend was exactly reversed from what he describes. About half of the authors describe significant weight change as gender relevant. And often their relationships to food or body size were explicitly disordered. A lot of the authors talked about overcoming disordered eating. But in this group of authors, this small group, of course, trans women described gaining weight as a way to suppress acknowledgement of their gender identity, because who's ever heard of a fat woman? While trans men primarily talked about restricting to eliminate gendered fat distribution. So one example of this, Nicholas Ballou's 2016 Learning to Love My Trans Male Body After Years of Violence, was actually one of the only people who discussed his own weight loss in a really clearly positive way. And he said, I've had to eat more bananas in a month than most people do in their lifetimes, but dang, do my thighs cause me less distress now? So for him, he was really careful to designate that it wasn't the amount of weight that he had that he struggled with, but where he carried it. And it was making him feel more feminine than he wanted to. And he hints at what sounds like pretty intense dieting to my eyes. And he describes this feeling of relief that at least he doesn't have to worry about the dysphoria of his thighs anymore. And this is also something that I think is really worth discussing. No one is allowed to have fat thighs. The gender binary model tends to assume that gendered experiences are complementary. What is true of a woman is not true of a man, and vice versa. Fat thighs came up as gender invalidating across a wide range of genders and sex assignments. There wasn't anybody who was like, yeah, I have fat thighs and that is exactly what's correct for my gender. So it wasn't that, you know, one gender is allowed to have fat thighs and another gender is not. But it was actually that thighs were, like fat thighs, were too feminine for men and too masculine for women. And that's obviously a really binary model. And a lot of the people that I've quoted so far are non-binary. Which brings up the question of like, what's happening with that? And the answer that I have so far is that people of all genders reported navigating gendered norms that were not responsive to their identity, but to the roles that they were being assigned at particular moments. And so people might experience fat shaming that was gendered based on their assigned sex at birth, and then also fat shaming based on their transitioned gender later, or with non-binary people, often whatever gender that we're being perceived at as a particular moment. And it wasn't necessarily like, aha, women have this experience, men have this experience, non-binary people, question mark. It was more like, these experiences are not actually opposite each other, but very much in the way that, you know, Bell Hooks describes, where within cis populations, everybody is punishing femininity. And then that looks different ways based on where you are in the gender hierarchy. It was very similar to that. Everybody was being punished for fatness and everybody was being punished for femininity. And some people are also being punished for masculinity in some ways.